Thank you. After all that introduction, I'm going to violate one of my most basic rules. I don't normally like to read things, but I'm going to read from something. And so all this idea of it being fun and so on is going to be irrelevant today. It's going to be dull. And my job here is to, if you've enjoyed the conference, my job here is to ease you into the end of the conference so that it won't be so painless or so painful for you when it ends. It reminds me of a comment that Elder Holland made once in a meeting I was in where he said that he hoped that when he died it came in high priest group meeting because the transition would be barely noticeable. I've been working on a project, what Lou Midgley likes to call a secret project. A little item that I'm trying to write and put together, and what I've decided to do is to choose a couple of passages from the final chapter in that secret project. Now you have to understand that what I'm going to be doing here is trying to analyze evidence that I've already given in the chapter, and it's evidence of the kind that you've already heard, except I'm hoping to get it in a more concentrated dose than we typically get it. But I'm going to look at two specific issues. One is the nature of the dictation process of the Book of Mormon here in what I'm calling Section A of this little piece. And then Section B, kind of preliminary logical analysis of the different hypotheses that have been offered for the production of the Book of Mormon. And this is kind of a rough take. This is something I've written this week. And so I'm hoping to get some good criticism on it and see how it works. All right, so I'll just start off reading and commenting on it. I hope it won't be too dull, but they did leave it wide open for me, largely because I refused to give them a title. And so this is what they get for allowing me that latitude. One of the most interesting developments in Book of Mormon studies recently is the fact that Royal Skousen's work on the manuscript history of the Book of Mormon has begun to appear. And so now the manuscripts of the Book of Mormon itself can be entered as evidence in an analysis of the book. Royal has devoted a decade and a half to intensive study of the text of the Book of Mormon, and most especially to the original and printer's manuscripts of the book. It's his strongly considered opinion that the manuscript evidence supports the traditional account of the origin of the Book of Mormon, and that it doesn't support the notion that Joseph Smith composed the text himself or took it from any other existing manuscript. Yet all of the witnesses to the process thought that Joseph Smith somehow saw words and read them off to his scribes. I'd like to look at some of the relevant data. And this is, as I say, just kind of a brief summary take. First of all, the evidence strongly supports the traditional account in saying that the original manuscript was orally dictated. The kinds of errors that occur in the manuscript are clearly those that occur from a scribe mishearing, rather than from visually misreading while copying from another manuscript. And I could give you lots of examples of those, but it would take time. I will in the written version of this, eventually. The printer's manuscript, by contrast, shows precisely the types of anomalies and problems that one would expect from a copyist's errors. He's visually copying from the original manuscript into the printer's manuscript. Professor Skousen's meticulous analysis even suggests that Joseph was working with 20 to 30 words at a time in this process. Now, it's apparent that Joseph could see the spelling of names on whatever it was that he was reading from. When the scribe had written the text, he or she would evidently read it back to Joseph for correction. So the prophet evidently had something with him from which he was dictating, and against which he could check what his scribes had written. But what was it? The witnesses are unanimous that he did not have any books or manuscripts or papers with him during the translation process, which involved lengthy periods of dictation. In an interview with her son not long before she died, Emma Smith insisted that Joseph had no text with him during the work of translation. Question: had he not a book or manuscript from which he read or dictated to you? Answer: he had neither manuscript or book to read from. Question: could he not have had and you not know it? Answer: if he had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. Now, Emma Smith could speak authoritatively regarding the period during which she herself served as a scribe. What about the much longer period when Oliver Cowdery was taking dictation? While they were in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where most of the Book of Mormon text was committed to writing, Emma says that Joseph and Oliver were not far away from her. Question: where did Father and Oliver Cowdery write? Answer: Oliver Cowdery and your father wrote in the room where I was at work. A correspondent from the Chicago Times interviewed David Whitmer on the 14th of October, 1881, and got the same story. Mr. Whitmer emphatically asserts, as did Harris and Cowdery, that while Smith was dictating the translation, he had no manuscript notes or other means of knowledge, save the seer stone and the characters as shown on the plates, he being present, that is he, David Whitmer, being present and cognizant how it was done. Similarly, The St. Louis Republican, based upon an interview in 1884, reported that Father Whitmer, who was present very frequently during the writing of the Book of Mormon, affirms that Joseph Smith had no book or manuscript before him from which he could have read, as is asserted by some that he did. He, Whitmer, having every opportunity to know whether Smith had Solomon Spaulding's or any other person's romance to read from. David Whitmer repeatedly insisted that the translation process occurred in full view of Joseph Smith's family and associates. The common image of a curtain hanging between the prophet and his scribes, sometimes seen in illustrations of the story of the Book of Mormon, is based on a misunderstanding. Further evidence that whatever else was happening, Joseph Smith was not simply reading from a manuscript comes from the Omaha Herald, reporting, perhaps somewhat condescending language, an 1886 interview with David Whitmer. The newspaper's correspondent speaks of the prophet's need to be spiritually or emotionally ready for the translation process to proceed. This rigorous exactment required him to be humble and spotless in his deportment in order that the work might progress. On one occasion, the prophet indulged in a stormy quarrel with his wife. Without pacifying her or making any reparation for his brutal treatment, he returned to the room in the Whitmer residence to resume the work with the plates. The surface of the magic stone remained blank, and all his persistent efforts to bring out the coveted words proved abortive. He went into the woods again to pray, and this time was gone fully an hour. His friends became positively concerned and were about to institute a search, when Joseph entered the room, pale and haggard, having suffered a vigorous chastisement at the hands of the Lord. He went straight in humiliation to his wife, entreated and received her forgiveness, returned to his work, and much to the joy of himself and his anxious friends surrounding him, the stone again glared forth its letters of fire. And you note here, incidentally, his propensity to retire to a grove of trees to pray when he was faced with a serious problem. It seems to me this adds plausibility to his accounts of the first vision, and there are other stories of his retiring to a grove to pray as well. Perhaps, of course, emotional distractions interfered with Joseph Smith's ability to remember a text that he had memorized the night before for dictation to his naive secretaries. Or perhaps personal upheavals distracted him from improvising an original text for them to write down as it occurred to him. Now, whether it's even remotely plausible to imagine Joseph Smith or anybody else memorizing or composing nearly 5,000 words daily, day after day, week after week, in the production of a lengthy and complex book is a question that people can ponder for themselves. I might just add that I've had a fairly productive 2 years in terms of writing over the past 2 years, and I've kept weekly, in fact daily records of the number of words I've produced. I've averaged just over 3,000 words a week for the past 2 years of what I regard as publishable prose. Some of it has been published, has resulted in, so far, at least one very bad book and several articles. In any event, that's a fairly good level of productivity. And I'm not working at it full time, but I'm working fairly consistently at it. And we're looking in the production of the Book of Mormon at a process that's resulting in almost 5,000 words a day for a period of just a little over 2 months. To me, that's breathtaking. That's really astonishing, especially for a person with Joseph Smith's level of education. And people who say, well, he just had a great imagination and it gushed out of him, need to try it. Books don't gush, at least in my experience. I wish they did. An anecdote recounted by Martin Harris to Edward Stevenson seems to argue against the translation process being either the simple dictation of a memorized text or the mechanical reading of an ordinary manuscript that he had surreptitiously smuggled into the room. Harris is speaking about the earliest days of the work, before the arrival of Oliver Cowdery, when he was serving as scribe. After continued translation, we would become weary and would go down to the river, this is in Harmony, Pennsylvania, there by the Susquehanna, and exercise by throwing stones out on the river. While so doing on one occasion, I found a stone very much resembling the one used for translating, and on resuming our labor of translation, I put in place the stone that I had found. The prophet remained silent, unusually and intently gazing in darkness. Much surprised, he exclaimed, "Martin, what is the matter? All is as dark as Egypt." My countenance betrayed me, and the prophet asked me why I had done so. I said, to stop the mouths of fools, who had told me that the prophet had learned those sentences and was merely repeating them. Furthermore, it's clear from careful analysis of the original manuscript, and I won't go into detail here, but Royal Skousen has published on this, that Joseph did not know in advance what the text was going to say. Chapter breaks and book divisions repeatedly surprised him and had to be added as an afterthought by the scribe. Moreover, there were parts of the text that he did not understand. When he came to proper names he could not pronounce, or long words, recalled his wife Emma, he spelled them out. When Joseph could not pronounce the words, agreed David Whitmer, he spelled them out letter by letter. E.C. Briggs recalled an 1856 interview with Emma Smith in which she remarked of her husband Joseph's limited education while he was translating the Book of Mormon, and she was scribe at the time. He could not pronounce the word Sariah. And one time, while translating, where it speaks of the walls of Jerusalem, he stopped and said, "Emma, did Jerusalem have walls surrounding it?" When I informed him it had, he replied, "Oh, I thought I was deceived." As the Chicago Tribune summarized David Whitmer's testimony in 1885, he confirmed Emma's experience. In translating the characters, Smith, who was illiterate and but little versed in biblical lore, was oftentimes compelled to spell the words out, not knowing the correct pronunciation. And Mr. Whitmer recalls the fact that at that time, Smith did not even know that Jerusalem was a walled city. In its notice of the death of David Whitmer, and undoubtedly based upon its prior interviews with him, the 24 January 1888 issue of the Chicago Times again alluded to the difficulties Joseph Smith had with the text he was dictating. Smith, being an illiterate, would often stumble over the big words, which the village schoolmaster, Oliver Cowdery, would pronounce for him, and so the work proceeded. Thus, this is my summation paragraph on this particular section. Thus we see that Joseph Smith seems to have been reading from something, but that he had no book or manuscript or paper with him. It seems to have been a text that was new and strange to him, and one that required a certain emotional or mental focus before it could be read. All of this is entirely consistent with Joseph Smith's claim that he was deriving the text by revelation through an interpreting device, but it does not seem reconcilable with claims that he had created the text himself earlier, or even that he was reading from a purloined copy of somebody else's manuscript. In order to make the latter theory plausible, it's necessary to reject the unanimous testimony of the eyewitnesses to the process. Now that's a limited conclusion, but I think it's an important one if it can really be established and sustained. Now the second part of what I want to do here is an analysis of the various hypotheses that have been offered for the production of the Book of Mormon. There seem to me to be 8 basic possibilities for explaining the Book of Mormon, which fall into 3 general classes. I'll summarize them first in outline form. If I'd really been with it, I would have had a nice PowerPoint thing for you to see, but I only decided to do this late last night, and, well, anyway. I'll offer comments on them then one by one. The first general category is subjective explanations, which has 2 parts, either individual hallucination by Joseph Smith or collective hallucination by Joseph Smith, the witnesses, and others. The second general category, objective reality but fraudulent. First, you have the possibility of individual deceit practiced by Joseph Smith unaided. Second possibility, collective deceit by Joseph Smith, the witnesses, and etc. And the third category, collective deceit by Joseph Smith and some external individual or group. You could divide that, I suppose, collaboration with an external group or exploitation, stealing somebody else's manuscript, borrowing Solomon Spaulding's manuscript or something like that. The third general category, objective reality with supernatural explanations, supernatural in quotes, it's a problematic term. You have 3 possibilities there at least. One is that the Book of Mormon is supernatural but demonic. That's becoming popular in certain rather odd quarters. The second possibility, it's true scripture but it's not ancient. Or the third possibility, that it's simply true scripture, the traditional explanation. Now let's see what implications these different possibilities have. And at this point in what I'm writing, there will be a fairly lengthy, in fact, awfully lengthy, discussion of various kinds of evidences, of the kind often associated with farms, but other kinds of things as well. First, what I've termed the psychological explanations. The first one in that category is individual hallucination by Joseph Smith. Now this explanation seems to be virtually impossible to accept. I realize that there are books out fairly fresh on the market talking about the Book of Mormon as an attempt by Joseph Smith to work out his Freudian anxieties and things like that. To me, these things absolutely miss the point. There are simply too many corroborating witnesses for the Book of Mormon to be taken seriously as a product of individual hallucination. If Joseph Smith were simply fantasizing in some pathological parallel universe, it's exceedingly difficult to explain the fact that many others claim to have seen the holes in the ground, the stone receptacle, the angels, the plates, the breastplates, the Urim and Thummim, the sword of Laban, and all the other things that his wholly subjective fantasies called for. It's very odd that other people are seeing these things which don't exist. So we're led necessarily to another possibility, collective hallucination by Joseph Smith, the witnesses, and etc. This explanation is only slightly more plausible. It's virtually impossible to imagine a hallucination that continued over weeks, months, and years, involving numerous people whose hallucinatory illusions were so coherent and congruent with one another. People who, apart from their religious views, unacceptable in principle to certain critics, supply no other reason to think them psychologically maladapted. I mean, you look at someone like David Whitmer, who goes on in the 50 years he's separated from the church to be city councilman and then mayor of Richmond, Missouri. Oliver Cowdery, who leads a pretty successful life as a lawyer and so on. These people don't seem obviously mad. But anyway, I suppose that's what you have to believe. Moreover, many of the events that seem to support Joseph Smith's story occurred under wholly matter-of-fact conditions. David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, for example, climbing onto the Hill Cumorah and seeing the stone box from which the plates were taken. Emma Smith feeling the plates through their thin muslin cloth, moving them around while she does housework. Lucy Mack Smith seeing the breastplate. The 8 witnesses themselves standing in a clearing in the woods in broad daylight and leafing through the plates. William Smith estimating their weight at about 60 pounds. Gary Habermas's comment, now there's a deliberate point in quoting Gary Habermas here. He's a very, very prominent evangelical apologist who has written about the resurrection of Christ, quite persuasively, I might say. And I've had some correspondence with him about some of these issues. Gary Habermas, but it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to his logic being applied to the witnesses. Gary Habermas's comment about Christ's appearance to the 11 apostles is precisely relevant here and worth repeating. Hallucinations are private events observed by one person alone. 2 people cannot see the same hallucination, let alone 11. I'm fond of the fact that in both cases we're talking about the 11. I mean, it's an exact parallel. In support of his position, he cites personal correspondence from someone he describes as a well-published psychologist who writes, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly are not something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce a hallucination in somebody else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. And then I go on to quote from a Catholic apologist. Again, there's method in this. He's again talking about the resurrection. He says, hallucination is a solitary phenomenon. Carl Keating speaking. In medical literature, there are no records of even 2 people having the same hallucination at the same time. This neatly defangs a certain avenue of response to the Book of Mormon. A passage from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is apropos here. Theseus, the Duke of Athens, and his bride-to-be, Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, have just heard the tale told by the lovers Hermia, Lysander, Helen, and Demetrius of strange transformations and fairies in the woods. Hippolyta is impressed and puzzled by the story. "'Tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." And he responds, "More strange than true." This is the Book of Mormon critic. "More strange than true, I never may believe these antique fables nor these fairy toys." And she responds, "But all the story of the night told over, and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancy's images, and grows to something of great constancy." Now, A Midsummer Night's Dream is obviously fiction, of the most fantastic kind. Still, within the framework of the play, we know that the lover's story is entirely true, and that Oberon, Titania, Puck, and the others were in fact active realities. Hippolyta's point is an entirely sound one. The consistency of the tale told by various witnesses indicates that it rests upon more than mere imagination. It seems apparent, therefore, that we're obliged to assume that there was something, some objective reality, at the basis of the story of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. We'll first look at various explanations holding that yes, there was an objective reality, but it was an artifact of fraud. So first, individual deceit practiced by Joseph Smith unaided. It seems difficult to credit this as a believable explanation for the Book of Mormon. We've seen evidence, you would have if you'd read what I've written, which isn't finished. There is evidence, anyway, of Joseph Smith's sincerity and good character, which makes it difficult to imagine that he would be party to such a deceit. Of course, there's one theory that Joseph was a pious fraud, lying for Jesus, concocting a tale with which to resist the then popular heresy of deism. Whether even such a notion is compatible with the many testimonies of his honesty and character is dubious in my view. But entirely aside from the perhaps ultimately unresolvable question of his innermost character, Joseph Smith seems positively incapable of having pulled off such an enterprise on his own, unaided. He was, as those who knew him best readily and repeatedly noted, only marginally literate during the period of the production of the Book of Mormon. Certainly he seems an unlikely candidate to have produced a book manifesting all the apparently authentic ancient and Near Eastern characteristics which the book quite arguably possesses. There is even, as we have seen, quite persuasive evidence that he was unfamiliar with the text as he translated it, and that he struggled with its proper names and some of its vocabulary. Furthermore, could he have written something so sophisticated and complex in so short a time? Could he have fabricated gold plates? Where did he derive the metallurgical expertise? Where did he get the gold? Just now, gold is selling for about $275 an ounce. If William Smith's estimate of the plate's weight at 60 pounds was accurate, and if they were pure gold, their monetary value in today's terms was something on the order of $264,000. More likely they were a gold alloy, but clearly their value was far beyond the reach of the young son of a subsistence farmer. Where did the gold go when he was done with it? Did he just give it away? Bury it? How was he able to produce the breastplate and other artifacts that many saw? Was he really up on the hill Cumorah cementing a box and hiding it in the earth? Why did nobody notice any of this elaborate activity? Finally, it's very difficult to see how he convinced many of his associates to believe that they were seeing angels, experiencing miracles, hearing the voice of God, witnessing examples of otherwise impossible prophetic foreknowledge. For lack of a better word, such supernatural aspects of the story are exceptionally difficult to account for on a hypothesis of simple fraud. It might possibly be suggested, of course, that Joseph Smith profited from the happy coincidence that his fraudulence was supported by a gang of gullible lunatics who saw visions on command and even independently, all endorsing his story. But the improbabilities seem too high. The celebrated Occam's razor, attributed to the medieval philosopher William of Ockham, has become an important principle in the construction and evaluation of scientific hypotheses. It advises scientists and scholars not to multiply entities beyond what is necessary to explain the data at hand. That is, if a lunar eclipse can be fully explained by understanding the position of the sun, earth, and moon, there's no need to bring in any additional notions, such as, for example, a hungry moon-eating dragon, to explain the phenomenon. The razor also warns scientists and others against rickety structures of conjecture that simply become too complicated to be taken seriously. Simplicity and elegance are increasingly recognized as important principles in the construction of scientific theories. An odd fact, incidentally, on the atheistic supposition of a random, purposeless universe. The Ptolemaic view of the solar system, for example, finally collapsed under the weight of all the cycles and epicycles that had to be invoked to explain the observed astronomical data, when Copernicus and Kepler showed that the same data could be explained by means of a relatively simple and logically elegant alternative model. Ptolemaic astronomy was dead. Similarly, it seems, composite theories that purport to explain the Book of Mormon on the basis of fortuitous combinations of inconceivable cunning, superhuman talent, bottomless credulity, and successful, well-balanced lunatics is ultimately too cumbersome to be plausible. Accordingly, we're obliged to move on to the suggestion the Book of Mormon was the product not of simple fraud, perpetrated by one fiendishly, peerlessly clever individual, but of collective fraud. First, we look at the notion that I've labeled collective deceit by Joseph Smith, the witnesses, etc. This hypothesis would account for the supernatural elements of the story of the emergence of the Book of Mormon, in that it would simply allege that such things never happened. But it too, every bit as much as the idea of individual deception, collides with the evidence that I have presented in other writing, not yet published, respecting the character of Joseph Smith. Moreover, it clashes directly with the evidence we have concerning the character of the witnesses and the others and their subsequent behavior. One of the things most frequently noted by those who interviewed David Whitmer in the last decades of his life is the reverence and awe with which he regarded the manuscript of the Book of Mormon that he had in his possession. He refused to part with it for any sum of money, though he was by no means wealthy, and both he and his family felt not only that it was divinely protected, but that they would share in that divine protection so long as they owned it. Whether their sense of the manuscript's near supernatural potency be viewed as misplaced or not is irrelevant to the issue at hand. Such attitudes are simply impossible to square with cynicism and conscious deception on his part. There's simply no sign of dishonesty or conspiracy among Joseph Smith's associates. And in the case of a group so large, 11 official witnesses, plus Mary Whitmer and Emma Smith and Lucy Mack Smith and William Smith and others, it would be inconceivably difficult to keep such a conspiracy under wraps. Particularly so as the alleged conspirators suffered much, including death in a few cases, for their supposed plot, gained nothing, were in many cases alienated from Joseph Smith, and collectively lived several decades after the death of the prophet, entirely isolated from any supportive or ego-gratifying community. As the lawyer James H. Moyle justly observed after interviewing David Whitmer at length and applying to him all his cross-examining skills, if there had been fraud in this matter, Joseph Smith would have cultivated those men and kept them with him at any cost. The truth is that when they became unworthy, they were excommunicated, even though they were witnesses to the Book of Mormon. In a 22 September 1899 letter, David Whitmer's grandson, George Schweich, recalled that his grandfather, quote, "I have begged him to unfold the fraud in the case, and he had all to gain and nothing to lose, but to speak the word if he thought so. But he has described the scene to me many times. of his vision about noon in an open pasture. There's only one explanation barring an actual miracle, and that is this. If that vision was not real, it was hypnotism. It was real to grandfather in fact. But as we've seen, hallucination, whether individual or collective, seems incapable of explaining the facts connected with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Still, even if a conspiracy involving Joseph Smith, the witnesses, and his family and other close associates seems highly unlikely, it may still be the case that other conspirators, wholly or largely invisible in the story, may have collaborated with and worked through Joseph Smith to deceive his family, his friends, and the world. Or at least that other people may even innocently have provided Joseph Smith with what he needed in order to practice his deceptions. So we come to what I've termed collective deceit by Joseph Smith and some external individual or group. There are two fundamental possibilities here, represented in my outline above. In the first scenario, an individual co-conspirator or a group of co-conspirators, more learned and sophisticated than Joseph Smith, actually wrote the Book of Mormon, and in some fashion or other helped him persuade his gullible kinfolk and friends that angels were visiting them, God was speaking to them, and the like. How they might have accomplished this long before the heyday of special effects is somewhat mysterious. Perhaps this conspiracy also fabricated the plates, created the Urim and Thummim, constructed the stone box and buried it in the hill, made the breastplate, and furnished the other necessary objects. But do we have any actual evidence for the existence of such a person or persons? Who specifically were they? I asked this question of a person advocating this theory just yesterday, or the day before, and he answered that he didn't know and probably never would know. Well, I think that's some liability for the theory. What were their motives? What did they have to gain? Certainly they never made any money, nor clearly did they gain notoriety. We don't even know who they were or if they were. Why did they remain silent? It's difficult to disprove the existence of silent, invisible conspirators, just as it's difficult to disprove the existence of an invisible giant rabbit. But the hypothesis seems unlikely. However, the second scenario may provide a solution to the problem. Perhaps the co-conspirators were unaware of Joseph Smith's appropriation of their literary work. Perhaps the actual author or authors of the book were dead. Here too, though, serious doubts intervene. This is a little out of order. I needed to rewrite this. Oh well. This is what you get for work in progress. With all the notoriety that Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon gained, it's hard to imagine that the actual author or authors of the book, if they were still living, would not have stepped forward to put an end to the charade and to claim credit of authorship. And in any case, witnesses to the translation process are insistent, as I've said, that Joseph Smith did not bring a manuscript with him and was not reading from an already written text. This fact seems to work against either form of the external conspiracy hypothesis. Moreover, the various authentically ancient and Near Eastern elements of the book are still unaccounted for by either hypothesis. And finally, it's simply hard to imagine how the process might have worked. The grammar and vocabulary of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon plainly represents non-standard English, of the kind that would be expected from a person of Joseph Smith's class and educational background in the early 19th century. If another individual or group of individuals, more learned, educated, and urbane, actually wrote the Book of Mormon, we have to assume that it was composed in something much more like the standard literary English of the early 19th century than what we actually see in the original manuscript. Or, alternatively, that a learned person deliberately composed it in uneducated frontier dialect. If the latter hypothesis is unacceptable, we can only guess that Joseph or someone like him took an originally standard English document and laboriously rewrote the whole thing in substandard language, perhaps in an effort to disguise its origins among the classically educated people of Dartmouth or the sophisticates of Philadelphia. Moreover, if the unwitting co-conspirator was dead or otherwise unaware of Joseph Smith's devious game, that would thrust back onto Joseph the production of all the props and special effects needed to create the confirmatory aura of supernaturalism surrounding the emergence of the Book of Mormon. Well, I see problems with all of these hypotheses. Thus far, we've been discussing hypotheses that might at least transiently be considered by anybody contemplating the puzzle of the Book of Mormon. Now, however, we leave atheists and naturalists behind and approach a realm that only those willing to entertain the possibility of what might be termed somewhat problematically supernatural power can enter. The first circle of this realm is the one I've called supernatural but demonic. Those who recognize that no naturalistic hypothesis can account for the historical data regarding the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, or for its seemingly strong links to antiquity in the Near East, but who still do not wish to take it as an authoritative spiritual guide, have this one last fallback position. They can concede virtually every argument advanced by advocates of the Book of Mormon, but neutralize the Latter-day Saint case by noting that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. In their support, they can cite the very words of Jesus regarding the last days. Impostors will come, claiming to be messiahs or prophets, and they will produce great signs and wonders to mislead even God's chosen, if such a thing were possible. Such an argument is difficult to deal with. It's perhaps fair to point out that such people themselves might be among those deceived. They should not discount that possibility. We're all fallible. But it's also fair to ask whether God is the kind of being who would allow people like the Smiths and the Whitmers and the Cowderys and Martin Harris and others, who the historical data clearly indicate were sincerely and prayerfully seeking him, to be led astray to perdition. If so, how can we trust him in anything? How can any answer to prayer or understanding of Scripture be relied upon? In the last analysis, though, advocates of the Book of Mormon must simply point to the test suggested by Jesus himself. Beware of false prophets, he said, men who come to you dressed up as sheep, while underneath they're savage wolves. But he did not say, as he surely could have, that all claimants to prophecy after his day would be marked by that very claim as false pretenders. That would have been simple. If a person claims to be a prophet, he's not. Instead, he said, you will recognize them by the fruits they bear. Can grapes be picked from briars or figs from thistles? In the same way, a good tree always yields good fruit, and a poor tree bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, or a poor tree good fruit. Advocates of the Book of Mormon can perhaps be pardoned for maintaining that the fruit of the Book of Mormon, in changed lives, in hardships overcome, deserts tamed, and other regards, has been good, indeed remarkable. Those considering this issue will have to determine for themselves whether the doctrine and the life led by those who accept it tastes good. And as the Latin saying goes, there is no disputing about taste. The next possibility in the supernatural category, which I've called true scripture but not ancient, seems in principle a little easier to deal with. According to this hypothesis, the Book of Mormon is true and authoritative scripture, but is not historically factual. That is, there were no real Nephites, Jaredites, and Lamanites. There was no real Lehi colony. Jesus did not really visit the Americas following his ascension in Palestine. The truths of the Book of Mormon on this understanding are purely doctrinal or even poetic, set for some reason in a framework of narrative fiction. Or perhaps the Book of Mormon should be compared to the parables of Jesus, which teach important principles, although they're clearly not intended as literal history. Nobody asks to know the real name of the prodigal son and his father, or the identity of their home village. It would be foolish to inquire after the name of the Good Samaritan, or his patient. Such a view obviously ascribes a certain value to the Book of Mormon, but it essentially neutralizes the value of the book as a second witness for Christ. For if Christ did not really appear to real Nephites, it is less than obvious that the Book of Mormon constitutes independent evidence for his divinity, his atonement, his resurrection. Still, the fundamental problem with this notion is that it seems to involve God in purposeless deceit. For the fabrication of the plates and the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim and the stone box seems to serve little purpose other than to witness to the existence of a real ancient civilization that really created the text and whose history is really represented in its stories. And who on this understanding was Moroni, really? Why masquerade as an ancient Nephite if there were none such? Couldn't theological truths have been revealed in some other way, even in some other way attended by spectacular displays of supernatural power and glory, but unaccompanied by misleading historical falsehoods? The Doctrine and Covenants was revealed without any mythical ancient history surrounding it. For when all is said and done, the complex story in the Book of Mormon, with its genealogies and descriptions of battles and the like, turns out on this hypothesis to be nothing more than a lie. The parables were never intended to be taken as history. The Book of Mormon clearly was and is. We're left with the last possibility, the one that, to nobody's surprise, I find preferable and most likely. This is the idea that the Book of Mormon, as the traditional story has always insisted, is true scripture and historically authentic. All of the evidence that I'm going to present in this chapter is consistent with the hypothesis that the Book of Mormon is true, historically authentic scripture. Indeed, in my view, some of the evidence that I'll present virtually demands such a verdict. That's it.
Time for a few questions.
I'd never heard that David Whitmer had a copy of the manuscript.
I need to go to the mic. Sorry.
They do this in testimony meeting nowadays. I think it's barbaric. In the good old days, people could just stand up where they were and save time. This is the first time I've ever heard that David Whitmer had a version of the manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Can you tell us which manuscript this was and what has become of it?
As my understanding is that it's the printer's manuscript, and it's now in the possession of the Our Elias Church. You read the accounts, the interviews with him, it's clear that he felt that the Utah Church wanted it, which I'm sure is true. Joseph F. Smith and Orson Pratt visited him, and you get different accounts of whether they offered him money or how much. I mean, several times it said they offered him $100,000. I find that dubious. One account says they offered him $1 million or anything he wanted, which I find extremely dubious. Joseph F. Smith said we offered him nothing, and said this was in the days before critical textual analysis was really in. Joseph F. Smith says, look, we've got the printed version, the manuscript's worthless. We don't want it. We don't care. If he gives it to us, fine. But anyway, David Whitmer goes out of his way and says repeatedly, he must say this in at least 10 or 15 different places that I know of, that people offered him money for it, people wanted it, well, he's not giving it up. And they tell the story of a cyclone that had hit Richmond, Missouri, and seriously damaged his house. But the room where the record was kept was not damaged at all. And they felt that was providential. And so there's this sense in the whole family that having that manuscript preserves them and gives them safety. This is, I think, almost bordering on the superstitious, but the one thing it certainly is not is dishonest and cynical with reference to the Book of Mormon manuscript. They clearly believe it's a sacred object and too precious to give up even for money, any amount of money.
I have a couple of things here I'm wondering about. We talk about the witnesses, and we know that for the most part Joseph kept the plates out of sight, either covered. I believe Emma was allowed to have the plates still covered in a cloth, but she wasn't allowed to see them. But what about the Urim and Thummim? Was that kept out of sight to the degree of the...
No. No, there are various people who say that they saw the Urim and Thummim. Although I haven't come up with too many specific accounts of it, but people allude to having seen it. Lucy Mack Smith says she saw it. And that was apparently, there was not the same prohibition surrounding that as surrounded the plates.
The other question I have kind of goes in with that one. And I'll be honest, I'm not a Mormon historian, and I don't know as much about it as I should. But there seem to be accounts that seem to say that Joseph would translate without the plates.
Yeah, David Whitmer is fairly consistent in saying that after the experience of the loss of the 116 manuscript pages, the plates were taken away and were not brought back except on occasion, and that Joseph was then translating with the seer stone without the plates present. There may be other accounts that suggest something a little different than that, but that's not unreasonable to me. I think that may be true. One thing that needs to be emphasized here, and I probably should have emphasized it in what I wrote, is that there are people who say, well, Joseph Smith just faked this, he created some fake plates. But when the three witnesses, for example, see the angel, they don't only see the plates, they see a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, there was a factory at work producing this stuff there in the Palmyra area. It's a sword, a breastplate, Urim and Thummim plates, all sorts of things, and other plates that they claim to have seen. So it's not enough merely to have produced a 60-pound gold object. You've got to produce a lot more than that.
My last question you may not be able to answer, but maybe you can guesstimate. Assuming that all of the Near Eastern aspects of the book are true, some of the things that Matt Roper touched on today are true, how many sources or how many books would Joseph have had to have access to in order to accomplish this work?
A huge number, and it seems to me it's just utterly irrational to suppose that he did. Now that's why, in one particular case where I'm corresponding with a person, he says, well, no, it wasn't Joseph Smith, it's this cabal of conspirators somewhere else. He has a fixation on Dartmouth, which is why I mentioned Dartmouth in the paper. So it's this really sophisticated group who are doing all these things. Even that I find very difficult to imagine. And many of these things, the parallels that we think we're finding, which I think are not illusory, seem to me far beyond the capacity of even the most learned Dartmouth scholar to have come up with. But again, there's simply no evidence for this conspiracy.
Weren't the chiastic structures not even found until into the...
There were some people starting to talk about reverse parallelism, but whether that had reached North America or not is a really big question. I certainly don't think it had reached the taverns and farm implement stores of Palmyra.
Thank you.
One critic includes David Whitmer as one of the scribes, and after many years of searching over all the records I can find, I have not found any direct evidence including him except for one author and just a slight allusion to it. Can you comment on that?
Well, I just reread Lyndon Cook's collection of David Whitmer interviews, which is a really nice collection. I don't know how many there are, but scores of interviews and secondhand accounts, people who visited him, particularly during his last 20 or so years. And I don't remember him ever mentioning serving as a scribe. though he said he was in and out of the room. You know, this idea of the curtain that we sometimes see in the paintings that divides Joseph from the scribe. David Whitmer says that there was a curtain, but it was not between the prophet and the scribe, but blocking the front door of the house so that strangers couldn't come by and just peek in or disturb the process, but that he could see what was going on. And Emma seems to be saying the same thing. Emma serves as a scribe, but I don't know of any evidence offhand that David did.
I had two questions. First of all, where in your paradigm of hypotheses would you place the theory of automatic writing or spirit writing that some people, Larry Foster and others, have come up with?
Well, I'd probably put that under personal hallucination. I presume, this is one area that I want to do a little more reading on, that spirit writers really do believe that they're receiving something from outside, but they're not. It's coming from their own minds in some way or another. So I would put that under the heading of personal hallucination, which is a pretty big category. But again, the problem with that is it doesn't account, even assuming this were true, even assuming Joseph Smith is just coming up with this out of the other half of his brain or something like that. The fact is there are other people seeing plates and angels and all that sort of thing. And I don't see how Joseph's mental incapacity would explain their experiences.
My second question was, you alluded earlier to thinking that Joseph seemed to be reading from something, but not from a text that was there. But if you didn't have a text that was there, what was he reading from? And are you suggesting the old David Whitmer thing that he was reading off the stone is correct, or do you have some
It
other
seems
idea?
to be something like that he is reading off something, and the stone is as good a guess as any. I mean, Joseph, when given an opportunity to talk about the details of the translation process, didn't. He said it wasn't for the world to know all those things, so he wasn't going to do it. Hiram even asked him. Normally he did anything Hiram wanted, but this time he didn't. And I don't know why, but David was not a participant in the translation process directly, but probably talked with Joseph. He had some notion, even if he distorted it, of how it actually worked. But the fact is, and Royal Skousen has put together some very good evidence from this, that the scribes would read things back to him. He must have had something. Either he remembered 30 words. Royal has very sophisticated arguments for arguing that this was in 30-word segments, 20 to 30 words. Either he remembered it that well, or he was actually looking at something, but not a manuscript. This is where I say, you get a situation where he seems, yes, to be reading something, but not from anything he brought into the room except the seer stone.
If we go in that kind of David Whitmer direction, does that affect anti-Mormon arguments about kind of the inerrancy of the text?
Well, not to my mind. I mean, it seems to me that even some sort of device as that might still be interacting in some way with the recipient's mind. In some ways, I think that the stone may have been simply a device for concentrating attention. As, frankly, some of the critics will point out, stones serve that function in occultic traditions as well. I mean, you focus on something. Meditation traditions do the same thing. I'll tell a story that this is not an academic story, but it was something that was told to me years ago that seems to me maybe to shed light on something like this. Sort of a faith-promoting story, but I heard it from the person that was directly involved. When I was a freshman at BYU, I went to a meeting where a very old man, a patriarch, at that time in his 90s, spoke. And I have racked my brain for years trying to remember his name. And I ran across something about 5 years ago where it gave his name, and I thought, I've got to copy that down, and I lost it. Wouldn't you know? But maybe somebody else knows this story. He told of being ordained a patriarch. He lived somewhere out in the desert, southeastern Utah, I think, and he'd never had a patriarchal blessing, didn't know what they were supposed to be like, and he was terrified. And in those days, they got no assistance, no manuals, no guidebook, nothing. So he went for several months and didn't have to give a blessing. And he thought, how wonderful. Maybe I'll never have to do it. Well, then some kid came to him and said he wanted one, and a couple of weeks off, and so he was terrified. So he sat down and he wrote out a blessing, what he thought would be a really good one, memorized it. And he was ready to give this blessing when the kid came. But he said when the boy came and he put his hands on his head, for some reason he felt inspired to open his eyes. And he said he saw on the wall opposite him a text appearing. This sounds just like the David Whitmer story of the Book of Mormon. He said a line would appear and he would read it off, and when he read it off it would disappear and the next line would appear. And he said it was utterly unlike what he had planned to give to the boy. But it was a very good patriarchal blessing. Well, he said this never happened again. But he said it didn't need to. I wasn't worried anymore. I knew that somebody was going to stand behind me. So to my mind, that story in his case was it was like a training device to help him along, getting past over the hurdle of knowing that this really would work. And maybe that's the way it worked with Joseph Smith too. I don't know. But my argument here is that you do have him reading from something, but not from a manuscript. So what's he reading from? Well, he must have something there, and it's a text he didn't write, and he doesn't know, and he doesn't even understand sometimes. I'm going to add a portion here that points out, Royal makes a really good argument, that in 1837, when Joseph is correcting the Book of Mormon, he corrects a few places where, in Royal's opinion, the text wasn't wrong. Joseph himself misunderstood. They're trivial things, really trivial. He changes a noun to a participle where he doesn't need to do that. And he says it's quite clear from his point of view that that Joseph is not altogether familiar with this text. It's not his text. And he was given it by revelation in 1828, 29, 30. But after that, he stands to it as anybody else stands to it in a way.
These are the last 3 questions, so keep it short.
Okay. First of all, how many different methods do you know of that Joseph used to translate? And then my real question is, do any of those correlate with the scribe that he was using at the time?
Yeah, well, you have the Urim and Thummim, and then you have the seer stone. David Whitmer's claim is, and again, I need to check this, but David Whitmer's claim is that that Joseph had the Urim and Thummim, used the Urim and Thummim in the first portion for the 116 pages, and then after that episode, the Urim and Thummim was taken away, and he was given the seer stone in its place, and he used that. Now, I'm not sure that the process was altogether different, really, except that the plates may not have been actually physically present during the latter part of the translation. I mean, Joseph couldn't read the plates anyway. It's not like me hacking my way through an ancient text with a lexicon where I have to look at the text. If Joseph could look at the text all day long, he still wouldn't understand it except by revelation. So in a sense, it didn't matter whether the plates were there or not. He was dependent on revelation. The plates could be in Buffalo or in China, or they could be right on the desk. He still couldn't read them unaided. So I know of only 2 basic processes, and they're basically alike. Sorry, I go on too long. Would you like to ask a question?
You know what?
Step up there.
You just answered my question, because my question had to do with the fact that he used the Urim and Thummim and then the seer stone, and then was it not true after a time that those were tools to teach him how to do it, and then after a time he didn't use either?
Right, that's right.
Is that?
Yeah, and so I think, again, they're like training wheels on a bicycle. He didn't need them anymore.
I'm going to need you to write out your answer because I'm now deaf, but I actually have 2 questions. My first question is a fairly simple one. Out of all the artifacts that were found with the plates, do we know if any of them are still in possession of the church? And number 2, my second question, Oliver Cowdery had the opportunity to translate. And I know of no accounts that describe that attempt other than what's in the Doctrine and Covenants. Is there anything that is anecdotal that has been registered by anybody's journals and whatnot? And if so, is there anything that we can glean out of that about the process of revelation?
In terms of whether we still have anything that was found with the plates, I don't know of anything we have. The seer stone, yes, but the seer stone wasn't found with the plates. That came later. Elder G. Smith has one of the boxes, not the box that was found in the hill inn, but the box that the plates were. Yeah, the box that Alvin made that the plates were carried around in. So but nothing that was found with the plates in the hillside that I know of is still in possession of the church. Now, let's see, the second question was, Oliver Cowdery, did he translate? I have heard allusions to the idea that Oliver actually may have pulled off a little bit of translation, but I don't know of any evidence for that. I would be very interested in finding out whether he could. I have to say, it's always puzzled me a little bit, the idea of studying it out in your mind. I mean, I could sit there and look at the plates all day long, and I would not still have the foggiest idea what they were saying. I could guess all sorts of things, but I'd have no basis for the guess. So I'm not quite sure still how that process would work.
How do you square the idea of an inspired, given translation and mistakes, or those people who would propose mistakes in the Book of Mormon?
Well, first of all, I do see divine-human interaction in all these things. It doesn't bother me to have mistakes in a text like that. Again, I don't think that don't think that the seer stone or the Urim and Thummim were a machine, that produced a kind of infallible translation. As I say, it may have been simply an object for him to concentrate his mind in order to receive revelation. Well, the revelation, as revelation always does, comes through a human mind. It interacts with what the human has in his mind. And so I would not be surprised. I would expect the language of the Book of Mormon to be, to some extent, Joseph Smith's language. Although clearly some of it surprised even him. The big words that he couldn't read and things like that, the names that he couldn't pronounce. But I'm not at all committed to the idea of inerrancy anywhere. So I'm fine with the idea of linguistic problems, grammatical errors in the Book of Mormon. I might say, though, that some of the grammatical errors turn out to be, I think, as Royal Skousen quite persuasively has shown in the case of some of them, and others, John Twetness has worked on this, turn out to be Hebraisms. That you might have an over-literal translation from a Hebrew original that results in a kind of weird English that no English speaker would ever use, but a Hebrew speaker would. Or in other cases, simply what looks to us to be non-standard English today was not so clearly non-standard in rural New York in the early 19th century. Some issues, some grammatical and style issues that have now been resolved, weren't resolved. If you check them out in the early 19th century, they were still fairly free. And so the Book of Mormon is not standard upper-class English of the kind you get out of New York or Philadelphia in the early 19th century, but it's not necessarily wrong. The language has changed since then. So